Karoline Leavitt took a deep breath, gazing at the chaotic scene unfolding outside her office window. The nation was on the brink of a scandal that could bring down the entire administration. And she was right in the middle of it. As White House press secretary, Karoline had faced her fair share of tough days. But nothing prepared her for the battle ahead. The Department of Veterans Affairs was accused of mismanaging millions of dollars. Funds meant for the veterans who had sacrificed so much for their country. She had spent weeks preparing for the storm that was about to hit. Today was the day. Today, she would face the press. The journalists who had been waiting for her to slip up, to show any sign of weakness. The briefing room was filled with a palpable tension. Reporters adjusting their notepads, cameras aimed at her like 1,000 sharp eyes. But Karoline wasn't just here to answer questions. She was here to expose the truth, no matter the consequences. The first question came like a gunshot, sharp and unforgiving. A reporter from CNN asked about the leaked documents from the VA, showing a massive $62 million misallocation of funds. Karoline's mind raced, but her voice never faltered. She confirmed the authenticity of the documents with a calm demeanor. "The documents are real," she said, the words carrying weight. The room gasped as murmurs spread through the crowd. The scandal was real, and there was no escaping it now. But Karoline's eyes were fixed on Richard Coleman, the Undersecretary of Veterans Affairs, sitting at the front of the room. He had been the one to oversee the programs. And now, his name was at the center of the storm. As she looked at him, she saw the fear in his eyes, the cold sweat on his forehead. This wasn't just a briefing, it was the beginning of a battle for justice. The fight had started, and Karoline was ready to lead it. The room was tense as Richard Coleman stood to deny the allegations. He tried to downplay the situation, claiming that the leaked documents were taken out of context, that the numbers were exaggerated. But his words lacked conviction. Karoline could see the cracks in his facade. He was a man trying to salvage his reputation. But the evidence against him was undeniable. With a steady hand, Karoline presented the breakdown of the funds, how $62 million had been diverted from veterans programs, funneling into obscure consulting firms with no clear purpose. She could see the journalists' eyes widen as they took in the shocking figures. This wasn't just an error, this was a deliberate act of mismanagement. One that had cost veterans their healthcare, their dignity, and in some cases, their lives. But Karoline wasn't finished. She introduced the human cost of the scandal, the stories of veterans who had been denied essential care, who had waited for years to receive what they were promised, only to be let down by a system designed to protect them. She shared the story of a veteran who, after being turned away from a clinic, had taken his own life. His death was not just a tragedy, it was the result of a broken system, one that had failed him and countless others. The room fell silent. Karoline's voice trembled slightly as she spoke, but her conviction was unshakable. This wasn't about politics, it was about the lives of those who had served the country. The emotional weight of her words hit the room like a sledgehammer. Richard Coleman shifted uncomfortably in his seat, trying to regain his composure. But Karoline could see the doubt in his eyes. The first blow had been struck, and it was a devastating one. The following days were a blur of media interviews, press briefings, and late-night meetings with the White House. The pressure on Karoline was immense. The scandal had exploded, and the administration was scrambling to contain it. But Karoline refused to back down. She had made a promise to the veterans, and she was determined to keep it, no matter the cost. In private conversations, members of the White House staff urged her to back off. "This is getting out of hand," they said. "You're stirring up a hornet's nest. You need to think about the bigger picture." But Karoline wasn't interested in the bigger picture. She was focused on the veterans, on the men and women who had been abandoned by the very government they had sworn to protect. The political fallout could wait. Meanwhile, Richard Coleman was lashing out, trying to discredit Karoline. He accused her of turning a bureaucratic mistake into a political circus. He tried to paint her as a political opportunist, someone using the suffering of veterans for personal gain. But the public wasn't buying it. The more Coleman spoke, the more desperate he sounded. His denials were hollow, and his efforts to shift blame only made him look weaker. Karoline's resolve grew stronger with each passing day. She knew the risks. Her political career could be over if the administration turned against her, but she didn't care. The truth mattered more than anything else. Every time she stood before the press, she felt the weight of the scandal pushing down on her. But she refused to be silenced. The stakes were too high. Just when Karoline thought the situation couldn't get any worse, a whistleblower stepped forward, an insider from the VA, someone who had witnessed the corruption firsthand, came forward with a trove of documents that backed Karoline's claims. The whistleblower's testimony was a game changer. It revealed that senior officials, including Coleman, had deliberately covered up the financial discrepancies, shifting funds away from the veterans' programs and into the pockets of consulting firms with no real oversight. Karoline was ecstatic. This was the break she had been waiting for. She immediately held a press conference, releasing the new evidence to the public. The room erupted in disbelief as she presented the documents. Coleman's defenses were crumbling. The whistleblower had provided the smoking gun Karoline needed to prove her case once and for all. But even as the walls closed in on him, Coleman refused to back down. He tried to shift the blame to lower-level employees, accusing Karoline of cherry-picking information to fit her narrative. This is all a political ploy, he claimed, but his voice lacked the confidence it once had. The press was no longer on his side. Karoline had exposed the truth, and the public was beginning to demand accountability. The momentum was shifting, and it was clear that Karoline had won the battle of public opinion. The pressure on Coleman intensified, and he began to crack under the weight of the evidence against him. The day of reckoning had come. Karoline knew that she had one final chance to bring down Coleman and secure justice for the veterans. The Senate hearing was set, and Coleman would be forced to testify under oath. Karoline watched as the hearing unfolded, her heart pounding in her chest. The senators pressed Coleman on the specifics of the financial transfers, and with each question, Coleman's story became more convoluted, more desperate. Then, Karoline made her move. She presented the smoking gun email, the one that tied Coleman directly to the cover-up. The room fell silent as the senators read the email, the implications sinking in. Coleman had no more excuses. His lies had finally caught up to him. As the hearing continued, Coleman tried to defend himself, but it was clear that his political career was over. The evidence was irrefutable, and the public's support for Karoline grew stronger with each passing moment. She had done it. She had exposed the truth, and there was no turning back. But the victory came at a personal cost. Karoline had sacrificed relationships, lost friends, and endured intense pressure from all sides. The toll of the fight had been immense, and as she walked out of the Senate hearing, she felt the weight of the victory and the personal cost weighing heavily on her shoulders. The aftermath of the scandal was felt throughout Washington. Coleman resigned in disgrace, but Karoline knew that the battle for justice was far from over. The public had rallied behind her, but the political consequences were just beginning to unfold. The White House called her in for a private meeting, where the president commended her for her dedication but warned her that her actions had caused a rift within the administration. Karoline was torn. The fight for veterans had cost her more than she could have imagined. And now she had to decide what came next. She had exposed the truth, but the political realities were harsh. Her allies were few, and the road ahead was uncertain. But as she walked out of the meeting, Karoline knew one thing for sure: she wasn't done yet. The fight for justice wasn't over, and she would continue, no matter what it cost her. The Senate hearings were underway, and Karoline felt the weight of the entire nation's gaze upon her. She sat quietly in the back of the chamber, listening as the senators fired questions at Coleman, who was seated at the front. His previously composed demeanor had cracked under the pressure, but still, he tried to defend himself with a mix of false bravado and evasion. Coleman's voice quivered as he claimed, "I was not aware of any misconduct. These accusations are false. I did everything in my power to ensure the proper allocation of funds. The blame lies with the lower-level staff." His words were sharp, but they carried no conviction. Karoline knew the moment had arrived. She stood, her presence commanding attention. A subtle shift in the air signaled the impending turn of events. With a calm, but undeniable resolve, she took the floor. "Senators, I urge you to listen closely. What you are hearing is nothing but an elaborate attempt to shift the blame. The truth lies in the documents you've already seen and the testimony of the whistleblower who has come forward to expose the depths of the corruption. The room went silent as she presented the final piece of evidence, the sworn testimony of the whistleblower. An insider from the VA, who confirmed that Coleman had been directly involved in orchestrating the misallocation of funds. The testimony revealed how Coleman had deliberately concealed financial discrepancies, rerouting funds meant for veterans' health care and services to consulting firms that had no legitimate purpose. The room buzzed with shock as the senators read through the documents. Coleman's face had drained of color, his earlier defiance now replaced by panic. Karoline's words had landed like a thunderclap, and the truth was undeniable. But even in the face of undeniable evidence, Coleman attempted to salvage his reputation, claiming that the whistleblower's testimony was unreliable. "This is a smear campaign," he shouted, his voice breaking with desperation. "I have been the one fighting for our veterans." But Karoline's words were clear and unwavering. "You cannot hide behind your lies any longer. Mr. Coleman, you failed the very people you were supposed to protect." The hearing continued, but the damage was already done. The press outside was already reporting the breaking news. The evidence against Coleman had shattered his defense. And Karoline knew that this was the turning point. The momentum had shifted, and Coleman's career was on the verge of collapse. The media storm following the Senate hearings was like nothing Karoline had ever experienced. Her name was now on the lips of every journalist, every commentator. She had exposed the scandal in a way that no one had anticipated. She wasn't just a press secretary, she had become a symbol of justice and truth in a city where both were often in short supply. But the victory was bittersweet. Karoline had made enemies, powerful ones. The White House had grown increasingly uneasy with her actions. They had already warned her that her relentless pursuit of the truth was creating a rift within the administration. Some feared that Karoline's crusade against Coleman was a threat to the political future of the president, and pressure was mounting for her to step back. In a tense meeting with the president, Karoline found herself facing the most difficult decision of her career. The president commended her for her dedication, but his words were laced with concern. "You've done an incredible job, Karoline, but the political fallout is growing. Your actions have cost us allies, and the public's support is beginning to shift. You need to think about what comes next." Karoline stood tall, refusing to back down. "I understand the risks, Mr. President, but I will not stop until the truth comes out. This isn't about politics, it's about the men and women who served this country and were betrayed by those in power." The president sighed, clearly torn. "I respect your resolve, Karoline, but you're walking a dangerous line. We need to consider the broader implications of your actions." Karoline's heart pounded as she realized that the choice before her was more significant than just political strategy. It was a matter of principle. She had come this far for one reason: to hold the powerful accountable for their actions. No matter the cost, her mind was made up. She would not back down. She had already paid too high a price to turn back now. The fight for justice wasn't just hers to win, it was the people's fight. The news broke within hours. Richard Coleman had resigned in disgrace. His political career was over. The scandal that had threatened to shake the government to its core had finally claimed its first victim. Coleman's resignation was not a victory, but it was a start. Karoline had exposed the truth, and the public had responded. But the battle for veterans' rights was far from finished. While Karoline had been hailed as a hero by some, others questioned the cost of her actions. Within the administration, powerful figures were already plotting their next moves. Karoline had made enemies, and her position as press secretary was now in jeopardy. The whispers of those who wished for her downfall were growing louder. As she sat in her office, staring out over the Washington skyline, Karoline couldn't help but feel the weight of the personal cost. The friendships she had once valued were strained. Her colleagues in the White House were now cautious around her. The price of truth had been high, but Karoline had never been one to shy away from difficult decisions. She had done what was right, and for now, that was enough. But as she prepared for the next round of battles, she knew this was only the beginning. The fight for veterans, for the truth, was far from over. Weeks passed, and the media continued to cover the aftermath of Coleman's resignation. The public was still reeling from the revelations, but Karoline knew that the real fight was yet to come. Her efforts had put a spotlight on the systemic corruption within the VA. But the question remained. What would be done about it? Then, another bombshell dropped. The president had announced a major reform plan for the VA. But the question was whether it would truly address the issues or if it was just another political move to save face. Karoline knew that without meaningful change, the lives of veterans would continue to be neglected, and she could not stand by and let that happen. In a private conversation with her closest allies, Karoline made a bold decision. She would take her fight directly to the people. She would hold one last press conference, publicly challenging the administration's reform plan and calling for real, lasting change. The risks were enormous, but Karoline had no other choice. She had come too far to back down now. On the day of the press conference, the tension in the room was palpable. Karoline stood at the podium, the eyes of the nation upon her. She didn't hesitate. She called for an independent investigation into the VA, demanded accountability for those who had misused veterans' funds, and outlined a comprehensive plan for veterans' care that would ensure they received the support they deserved. Words alone are not enough, Karoline said, her voice strong and clear. We must act. We must hold those responsible accountable. The veterans who have sacrificed everything deserve nothing less. Her speech was a call to action, one that resonated with the public. The fight had not been won, but Karoline had sparked a movement. The momentum was building, and she knew that this was only the beginning of a much larger battle. As the press conference concluded, Karoline stepped away from the podium, her heart racing. She had taken the final step in her mission, and now, the rest of the world would have to answer. The road ahead was uncertain, and the political landscape was shifting under her feet. But one thing was clear: Karoline was no longer just a press secretary. She was a force to be reckoned with. In the days that followed, her calls for reform were echoed by veterans groups, political leaders, and the public. Pressure on the administration mounted, and Karoline's name became synonymous with the fight for justice. She knew that the battle for veterans' rights would be long and difficult. But she was ready for whatever came next. The story was far from over, but Karoline had made her mark. The future of Washington was uncertain, but with people like Karoline in the fight, change was possible, and she would not rest until the truth had been heard, and justice had been served. Just as Karoline thought she might have reached the end of her journey, an unexpected call came in. It was Ethan Carter, the veteran whose heartbreaking story had ignited the firestorm surrounding the scandal. He had watched Karoline's fight from the sidelines, and now, he had his own plans. I want to make sure this never happens again, Ethan said, his voice firm. I'm running for Congress, Karoline, and I need your help. The question hung in the air. Would Karoline continue to fight within the confines of the system, or would she help Ethan change it from the inside? The choice was hers, and the stakes were higher than ever. The battle for the future of veterans' care, and the future of Washington itself, was just beginning. As Karoline stood at the crossroads of her journey, she couldn't help but wonder what the next chapter held. The fight had been long, and the cost had been high, but she had proven that one person, armed with the truth, could bring about change. Her next steps remained unclear, but one thing was certain: Karoline Leavitt was far from finished, and the future of Washington would never be the same. As the dust settled from the battles Karoline had fought, her life began to shift. The White House, now at the mercy of public opinion and veterans organizations, began to push forward with the reforms she had demanded. The veterans' voices had been heard, and the systems that failed them were being overhauled. Yet, Karoline's personal journey was far from over. She found herself at a crossroads, grappling with the choice that lay before her. Ethan Carter, a man whose life had been forever marked by the betrayal of the system, was calling for her to join him. His plan was bold: run for Congress, and together, they would change the system from within. It was an opportunity Karoline couldn't ignore, and for the first time in a long while, she felt the stirrings of hope for a future where she could not only continue the fight but truly reshape Washington. She stared at the photo of the veterans she had met along the way, the faces of those who had inspired her and fueled her quest for justice. In their eyes, Karoline saw the reflection of everything that had been wrong with the system, and everything that needed to change. The battle might have been won in the public eye, but the fight for true reform was far from over. Ethan's call wasn't just a political proposition, it was a partnership. A chance to work together and create real, lasting change. Karoline thought of everything she had sacrificed, of the personal cost. And yet, she knew deep down that this new challenge was where she belonged. Whether it was through the press or through the halls of Congress, her fight for truth and justice would continue. The phone call with Ethan marked the beginning of a new chapter in Karoline's life. She wasn't sure where this path would lead, but one thing was certain: she would never stop fighting for the people she had vowed to protect. Washington had seen her rise to power, but it hadn't seen the last of her. With a renewed sense of purpose, Karoline knew her journey was only just beginning. Months passed as Karoline prepared for the future. She knew that the political landscape was shifting, and her role in it was more important than ever. The scandal had revealed the rot at the core of the system. And now, people like Karoline and Ethan were pushing to clean it up. As she watched the changes unfold in Washington, she couldn't help but feel a renewed sense of purpose. But with every step forward, Karoline was reminded of the high stakes. New alliances were forming, new enemies emerging, and the road ahead was fraught with obstacles. She had come a long way, but the hardest part of her journey was just beginning. Washington might never be the same again, but Karoline knew that the fight for a better future, one built on transparency, accountability, and justice, was worth every sacrifice. The choices she made would shape not just her own future but the future of the nation. She would face new challenges, but Karoline Leavitt was ready for whatever came next. Karoline stood at the threshold of a new beginning, whether through the halls of Congress or the streets where the people rallied for justice. She knew the work ahead would be demanding, but after everything she had endured, after all the sacrifices, the victories, and the losses, Karoline was more determined than ever to continue the fight. The future was uncertain, but she was ready to face it head on, knowing that no matter where her journey led, she would remain true to the cause. As she took a deep breath, stepping forward into the unknown, she realized one undeniable truth: the power of truth, of standing up for what is right, was unstoppable. And no matter what lay ahead, Karoline knew she would always be on the right side of history. With the future in her hands, Karoline walked forward, ready to shape a new world where justice was not just a distant dream but a living, breathing reality.